The morning sun cast long shadows across the parched hills of Galilee as King Guy de Lusignan adjusted his grip on the reins of his death. Sweat already beaded beneath his mail coif and the day had barely begun. Behind him, the largest Christian army ever assembled in the Holy Land stretched across the barren landscape, 20,000 men bearing the cross, their banners snapping in the hot wind that carried the scent of dust and approaching death. "My lord," whispered Gerard de Rydford, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, his weathered face grim beneath his white mantle. "The scouts report Saladin's forces have taken position near the Horns of Hattin. They block our path to Tiberias." Guy's jaw tightened. His wife's fortress of Tiberias lay besieged, its walls crumbling under the relentless assault of the Ayyubid Sultan's war machines. Every fiber of his being screamed to ride forth and break the siege. Yet the voice of caution embodied by Raymond III of Tripoli had counseled patience. "Let them come to us," Raymond had argued the night before. "In this heat, on this ground, we invite disaster." But pride and honor had trumped wisdom. The barons had demanded action, and Gaia, ever conscious of his tenuous claim to the throne of Jerusalem, had yielded to their bloodthirsty counsel. The army began its fateful march as the sun climbed higher, transforming the rocky terrain into a furnace. Knights in full mail gasped within their steel cocoons, while foot soldiers stumbled forward, their leather jerkins dark with perspiration. The true cross-atmos sacred relic of Christendom swayed above them, carried by the Bishop of Acre, its golden frame glinting like a beacon of hope against the merciless sky. According to medieval chronicler the libellus de expugnation terrae sanctae persona, the Christian army numbered approximately 20,000 men, making it the largest crusader force ever assembled in the Levant. Miles ahead, atop the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin, Sultan Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub surveyed the approaching enemy with the calculating gaze of a master strategist. His dark eyes, sharp as a falcon's, missed nothing, not the labored pace of the Christian knights, nor the telltale signs of an army already suffering from the brutal heat. At 49, the Kurdish Sultan had spent decades perfecting the art of warfare in these unforgiving lands, and he recognized opportunity when it presented itself. "They come to us like lambs to slaughter," murmured Aladil Saif al-Din, the Sultan's brother and most trusted general. Around them, the cream of the Islamic world's military might had gathered Mamluks from Egypt, Turkmen horsemen from the steppes, and the fierce warriors of Damascus and Aleppo. 30,000 strong, they held the high ground and, more crucially, controlled the precious springs that dotted the region. Saladin nodded, his beard catching the morning light. "Guy de Lusignan has sealed his own fate. By leaving the safety of Safaria, he has given us everything we could have hoped for." The Sultan's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had united the fractured Muslim world under his banner, who had transformed a collection of squabbling emirates into a unified force capable of challenging the Crusader kingdoms. As the Christian army trudged deeper into the trap, the temperature soared. Men began to collapse, their bodies unable to cope with the crushing weight of armor and the relentless sun. The baggage train fell behind, and with it, the precious water supplies that might have sustained the army through the coming ordeal. By midday, the true horror of their situation became apparent. The Muslims had set fire to the dry grass and scrublands, sending choking clouds of smoke rolling across the battlefield. The wind, as if summoned by some malevolent jinn, carried the acrid fumes directly into the faces of the advancing Christians, burning their eyes and searing their lungs with every labored breath. King Guy finally called a halt near the village of Hattin, but it was already too late. His army was trapped between the twin horns of the ancient volcano, with no water, no relief from the heat, and no hope of retreat. The greatest army of the Crusader states had walked willingly into a death trap, and the sun, that pitiless orb that had witnessed countless battles in these ancient lands, began its slow descent toward what would become one of history's most decisive encounters. The Christian army had become a writhing mass of suffering humanity trapped in a cauldron of their own making. As the afternoon sun reached its zenith, the temperature soared beyond endurance, and the smoke from Saladin's fires turned the air itself into a weapon. Knights who had faced death without flinching now wept openly as they gasped for water that would never come. Sir Balian of Ibelin, one of the realm's most seasoned commanders, moved among his men with grim determination. His own throat felt like parchment, but he forced himself to project calm authority. "Hold fast," he croaked to a young knight whose lips had cracked and begun to bleed. "We are soldiers of Christ. We do not yield to heathen tricks." But even as he spoke the words, Balian knew they rang hollow. This was no longer about courage or faith, it was about survival. And survival seemed increasingly unlikely. Around him, horses collapsed, their flanks heaving as they fought for breath. The destriers, those magnificent war machines that had carried European knights to victory across the known world, were reduced to trembling, foam-flecked shadows of their former selves. The true cross swayed dangerously as the Bishop of Acre struggled to remain upright. The sacred relic, which had supposedly been carved from the very wood upon which Christ had died, seemed to mock them with its presence. Where was divine intervention now? Where was the God who had delivered Jerusalem to the First Crusade? King Guy's council of war convened in the shadow of a rocky outpost. Though the term shadow is generous, the sun seemed to penetrate every crevice, every supposed refuge. Gerard de Rydefort, his white Templar mantle now stained with sweat and dust, pounded his mailed fist against his thigh. "We must break through," he declared. "Attack them before they can fully deploy. Our heavy cavalry can barely sit their horses," interrupted Raymond of Tripoli, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. "Look around you, Gerard. This is not or Hastings. This is hell itself, and we have marched willingly into Satan's embrace." The Count of Tripoli's words cut deep because they contained the bitter taste of truth, the flower of European knighthood. Men who had trained since childhood to fight in the cool forests and green fields of France and England were wilting like cut flowers in the merciless heat of the Levant. Their elaborate tactics, their centuries of martial tradition, meant nothing when a man could not draw breath without agony. Contemporary accounts from the Chronicle of Anul describe the Christian army as being so tormented by thirst that they could not speak or move, and many died from the heat alone before a single sword was drawn in anger. Meanwhile, Saladin's forces maintained their positions with the patience of desert predators. The Sultan had deployed his army in a great crescent, with the deadly Mamluk cavalry forming the points of the formation. These were not the feudal levies of Europe, bound by oaths of personal loyalty and concepts of chivalric honor. These were professional soldiers, men who had been trained from childhood in the arts of war, and who fought with the cold efficiency of those who kill for a living. Liddell moved among the ranks, his sharp eyes noting every detail of the enemy's distress. The Christians had formed a defensive circle, their shields locked together in the ancient manner, but it was a formation born of desperation rather than tactical advantage. "They're like wounded animals," he observed to his brother. "Dangerous still, but growing weaker with each passing moment." Saladin nodded, his face showing neither triumph nor pity. "Yet we must not underestimate them. A wounded lion is often more dangerous than a healthy one. When desperation overtakes a man, he may find reserves of strength he never knew he possessed." The Sultan's caution was well. Even in their extremity, the Christian knights represented a formidable force. Their armor, though it had become a curse in the heat, still provided protection against arrows and sword cuts. Their training, though compromised by thirst and exhaustion, remained superior to that of most infantry forces, and their desperation, as Saladin had noted, might drive them to acts of desperate courage that could yet turn the tide of battle. As the afternoon wore on, the psychological warfare intensified. Muslim marchers began to loose flights of arrows into the Christian ranks, not in massed volleys designed to kill, but in sporadic attacks meant to fray nerves and waste precious energy. Each arrow that found its mark was a victory, but each arrow that missed still served its purpose, forcing the Christians to maintain their guard, to crouch behind shields, to expend strength they could ill afford to lose. The sound of Muslim war drums began to echo across the battlefield, a rhythmic thundering that seemed to match the pounding of blood in the Christians' ears. The drums were joined by the haunting sound of war horns and the battle cries of men who sensed victory approaching on the evening wind. Kingai looked up at the sun, now beginning its descent, toward the western horizon. In a few hours, darkness would fall, and with it might come some relief from the crushing heat. But could his army survive until then? And even if they did, what then? They were surrounded, cut off from water, with no hope of relief or retreat. The king's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, and for a moment, the weight of the weapon felt comforting in his palm. Soon, very soon, there would be no more time for doubt or regret. The moment of decision was approaching, and with it, the fate of the kingdom of Jerusalem would be decided on these wind-blown sands beneath the scorch of a dying sun. The first assault came like a sandstorm, swift and merciless. As the sun began its ascent toward the western hills, Saladin's mounted archers swept down from the horns of Hattin in a coordinated attack that had been practiced to perfection across a dozen battlefields. The thunder of hoofbeats merged with the whistle of arrows as the crescent formation closed around the Christian position like the jaws of some great beast. Sir Reginald of Chatillon, the infamous lord of Corot, raised his scarred face to the approaching storm and laughed, sound devoid of humor and filled with the reckless abandon of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Come then, you sons of the desert," he roared, his voice carrying across the battlefield despite his parched throat. "Let us see if your curved swords can match good Christian steel." The impact was devastating. The first wave of Mamluk cavalry struck the Christian lines with the force of a battering ram, their composite bows sending volleys of arrows into the packed ranks. Before wheeling away to reload, the Crusader knights, weighed down by their armor and weakened by hours of torment, struggled to respond effectively to this fluid, mobile warfare. Brother Marcus of the Knights Hospitaller watched in horrified fascination as the enemy flowed around their position like water around a stone. These were not the crude tribal warriors his order had faced in previous campaigns, but supremely disciplined professional soldiers who moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Their tactics were alien to European eyes. They refused to engage in the direct, honorable combat that formed the backbone of Western military tradition. "They fight like demons," gasped Sir Hugh of Galilee, blood streaming from an arrow wound in his shoulder. They strike and vanish, strike and vanish. How can we come to grips with an enemy who will not stand and fight? The answer came from an unexpected source. Raymond of Tripoli, despite his earlier pessimism, had been studying the Muslim attack patterns with the calculating gaze of a veteran commander. They are not demons, he declared, his voice cutting through the chaos. They are horsemen, and horsemen need room to maneuver. If we can break their formation, disrupt their rhythm, ... Military historian Sir Charles Oman noted in his seminal work A History of the Art of War in the Middle Ages that the Battle of Hattin represented a clash between two fundamentally different military philosophies: defensive tactics of medieval Europe against the fluid, mobile warfare perfected in the deserts of the East. The Count of Tripoli's words sparked a desperate plan. If the Christians could not match the Muslims' mobility, they could at least deny them the space they needed to operate effectively. On Raymond's signet, the surviving knights began to contract their formation, drawing the circle tighter until the individual contingents merged into a single, bristling mass of steel and iron. The tactic worked. Initially, the Muslim cavalry found themselves forced to attack a hedgehog of spears and swords, their arrows less effective against the overlapping shields of the compressed formation. For a brief moment it seemed that European military tradition might yet prevail against Eastern innovation. But Saladin was too experienced a commander to be confounded by a single tactical adjustment. From his position on the higher ground, he could see the entire battlefield spread out like a map, and he recognized the Christian maneuver for what it was, a sign of growing desperation rather than renewed strength. Aladel, he called to his brother, never taking his eyes from the battle below. Deploy the infantry reserves. Let them taste the bite of Damascene steel up close. The Sultan's infantry were a different breed entirely from the horse archers who had opened the battle. These were men who fought on foot by choice rather than necessity, warriors who had honed their skills in the brutal urban warfare of Damascus and Aleppo. They carried the curved swords that had become legendary throughout the Islamic world, weapons that could cleave through mail and bone with equal ease. As the Muslim foot soldiers advanced, their war cries echoing across the battlefield, the true horror of the Christian situation became apparent. The compressed formation that had provided temporary relief against the cavalry now became a trap. Men could not maneuver, could not retreat, could barely swing their weapons in the press of battle. The fighting devolved into a grinding, brutal melee, where individual skill mattered less than endurance and the will to survive. Christian knights found themselves fighting not just against human enemies, but against the very elements themselves. The heat continued to sap their strength, the smoke burned their eyes and throats, and the weight of their armor, once a source of protection and pride, had become an instrument of torture. Gerard de Rietfort, his white Templar mantle now stained with blood and grime, found himself face to face with a Mamluk warrior whose curved sword moved like liquid lightning. The Grand Master's training took over, his own blade meeting the enemy's in a shower of sparks, but he could feel his strength ebbing with each exchange. Around him, the flower of Christian knighthood was beginning to wilt beneath the remorseless pressure of superior numbers and impossible conditions. King Gaia, still clutching the royal standard, watched his army disintegrate around him with the sick fascination of a man witnessing his own execution. The banners that had fluttered so proudly that morning now hung limp and tattered, their bright colors faded beneath layers of dust and blood. The true cross swayed dangerously as the Bishop of Acre struggled to maintain his footing in the chaos. "We cannot hold," Sir Balian of Ibelin reported, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. Blood ran freely from a gash across his forehead, and his sword arm trembled with exhaustion. "The men are falling where they stand. We need a miracle, or ... He did not need to finish the sentence. They all knew what the alternative was. Surrender was not merely a military defeat, it was the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, the collapse of 2 centuries of European expansion into the East. But miracles, it seemed, were in short supply on this day of judgment. As the sun continued its relentless descent toward the horizon, the circle of Christian resistance grew smaller and smaller, compressed by the inexorable pressure of Saladin's assault. The blood of 2 civilizations mingled in the wind-blown sands, and the scorch of the dying sun bore witness to the slow death of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The moment when hope finally died came not with a thunderous crash, but with a soft, almost gentle thud as the true cross fell to the bloodied earth. The Bishop of Acre had fought valiantly to keep the sacred relic aloft, but an arrow from a Mamluk archer had found the gap in his armor, and as he toppled forward, the golden cross that had guided Christian armies for generations was trampled beneath the hooves of enemy horses. A wail of despair rose from the surviving Crusaders, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of their souls. For many, the fall of the cross was more devastating than the loss of their companions, more final than the prospect of their own deaths. It was the visible symbol of God's abandonment, the ultimate proof that the Almighty had turned his face from his chosen warriors. Sir Balian of Ibelin, blood streaming from multiple wounds, fought his way toward the fallen relic with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. His sword, notched and stained with the gore of countless enemies, carved a path through the press of both, but for every Muslim he cut down, 2 more seemed to take his place. He screamed, his voice raw with emotion, "Save the cross!" But it was too late. A Mamluk warrior, his curved sword gleaming in the afternoon sun, had already claimed the sacred relic as his prize. The man raised it above his head in triumph, and his victory cry was taken up by 1,000 throats as the news spread through the Muslim ranks. The symbol of Christian power in the East had fallen, and with it, the last vestiges of Crusader morale. King Guy de Lusignan found himself isolated in a small knot of surviving knights, surrounded by the dead and dying remnants of his once mighty army. His royal banner still flew above his head, but it was a hollow symbol now, representing a kingdom that was crumbling with each passing moment. The weight of his crown, that circlet of gold that had seemed so important, mourning now felt like a millstone around his neck. The contemporary account of Ibn Alethea, the great Muslim historian, records that when the cross fell, the Christians lost all hope and threw down their weapons, for they believed that God had abandoned them to their fate. Gerard de Rydford, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood like a statue carved from stone, his white mantle now more red than white. Around him, the surviving members of his order had formed a final defensive circle, their discipline intact even in the face of certain death. These were men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But above all, they had sworn to defend the Holy Land against all enemies of Christ. "Brothers," Gerard's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the sudden lull that had fallen over the battlefield. "We have fought the good fight. We have kept the faith. Let us now go to our reward with honor." The Templars raised their swords in a final salute, their blades catching the dying light of the sun. They had faced death before, in a dozen battles across the length and breadth of Haurima, but never had they faced it with such certainty. This was not a tactical withdrawal or a strategic defeat. This was the end of their world. Saladin, watching from his position on the higher ground, felt no triumph in the moment. The Sultan was too experienced a commander, too student of history, to take pleasure in the destruction of brave men. He had fought Christians before, had respected their courage and their skill, and he knew that what was happening below was not just a military victory but a pivotal moment in the history of the East. My Lord Aladil approached his brother with careful steps, his own sword still bloodied from the fighting. "The Christian resistance is broken. They are calling for quarter." Saladin nodded slowly, his dark eyes never leaving the battlefield. "Let it be known that those who surrender will be treated with honor. They have fought bravely, and bravery deserves respect, even in defeat." The Sultan's words were carried across the battlefield by his heralds, and gradually, the surviving Christians began to lay down their arms. King Guy was among the first to surrender, his royal dignity intact despite the magnitude of his defeat. The sight of their monarch yielding to the enemy broke the last resistance of his followers, and one by one, the proud knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem threw down their weapons and submitted to their fate. But not all accepted surrender. Reginald of Chatillon, the infamous Lord of Carrick, stood defiant even as Muslim warriors surrounded him, his scarred face twisted into a snarl of contempt as he spat in the direction of Saladin's banner. "I will not yield to any heathen dog," he declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet battlefield. "Come and take me if you can." The challenge was answered by a dozen Muslim swords, and Reginald fell beneath their weight, his blood joining the countless others who had died on this day of judgment. His death marked the end of active resistance, the final period on the sentence that had been written in blood and sand across the hills of Hattin. As the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that matched the blood-stained earth below, the greatest army of the Crusader states had ceased to exist. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, that improbable European outpost in the heart of the Islamic world, was left virtually defenseless. The cities and fortresses that had taken generations to build and fortify now lay open to Saladin's advancing forces. The true cross, that most sacred of Christian relics, was being carried away by its Muslim captors, its golden surface reflecting the dying light of the sun. Whither went the dreams and aspirations of countless men who had traveled thousands of miles to fight and die in the Holy Land? The age of the Crusades was not ending. It would continue for another century, but it was fundamentally transformed on this day, when the blood of 2 civilizations mingled in the wind-blown sands of Galilee. The aftermath of battle always held its own peculiar horror, but the scene that greeted the survivors of Hattin was particularly devastating. The slope leading down from the twin peaks was carpeted with the bodies of Christian knights, their bright surcoats now dulled with dust and blood. The heat that had tormented them in life continued to work its malevolent magic in death, and a stench of corruption was already beginning to rise from the battlefield. Saladin rode slowly through the carnage, his face a mask of controlled emotion. The Sultan had witnessed many battles, had seen the aftermath of countless sieges, but the scale of destruction at Hattin was unprecedented. An entire kingdom's military might had been shattered in a single afternoon, and the implications of that victory were only beginning to sink in. King Guy de Lusignan knelt in the dust before the Sultan's tent, his royal regalia stripped away, his hands bound behind his back. The man who had ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem that morning was now just another prisoner, his fate dependent on the mercy of his captor. Yet there was still dignity in his bearing, still a trace of the royal authority that had once commanded the loyalty of thousands. "Your Majesty," Saladin's voice was courteous, almost gentle, as he addressed the fallen king. "You have fought bravely this day. Your soldiers died with honor, and honor deserves respect, even in defeat." The Sultan gestured to his servants, who brought forward a goblet of iced water, a luxury beyond price in the heat of the Levant. Guy's eyes fixed on the vessel with desperate hunger, his cracked lips betraying the extent of his suffering. When Saladin placed the goblet in his hands, the king drank deeply, the cool liquid bringing life back to his parched throat. "I thank you for your mercy, my lord." Guy's voice was hoarse but steady. "Though I confess I do not understand why you show such kindness to your enemies." Saladin's smile was sad, tinged with the wariness of a man who had seen too much of war. "Because, your Majesty, we are not so different. You and I, we both serve our God as best. We understand him. We both seek to protect our people and our faith. That you have failed does not make you evil, it makes you human." The account of Saladin's treatment of his prisoners, as recorded by the contemporary chronicler Baha ad-Din, emphasizes the Sultan's reputation for chivalry and mercy, qualities that earned him respect even among his Christian enemies. But if Saladin showed mercy to King Guy, the same could not be said for all his prisoners. Reginald of Chatillon, the Lord of Kerak, had been dragged before the Sultan's tent, his defiant manner unchanged despite his bonds. This was the man who had repeatedly broken truces with the Muslims, who had attacked pilgrim caravans and threatened the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. For him, there would be no goblet of water, no gesture of reconciliation. Reginald of Chatillon, Saladin's voice carried a cold edge that had been absent when he spoke to Guy. "You have broken your oaths, violated the sacred laws of hospitality, and brought dishonor to the very concept of What say you in your defense?" The Lord of Kerak's response was characteristic, a stream of curses and insults that would have made a tavern keeper blush. He showed no remorse, no recognition of his crimes, only the bitter defiance of a man who had lived by the sword and was prepared to die by it. Saladin listened to the tirade in silence, his face growing darker with each word. When Reginald finally finished, the Sultan drew his own sword, a blade of Damascus steel that gleamed like liquid fire in the dying light of the sun. "You have chosen your fate," he said simply, and with a single, clean stroke, ended the life of the most notorious of the Crusader lords. The execution sent a ripple of shock through the gathered prisoners, but it also served as a clear message. Saladin might be merciful, but he was not weak. Those who had committed crimes against the Muslim people would face justice, regardless of their rank or station. Gerard de Ridefoot, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, watched the execution with the stoic acceptance of a man who expected a similar fate. The Templars and Hospitallers had been singled out for execution by Saladin's decree. Their military orders represented the most dangerous and implacable enemies of Islam, and their continued existence posed a threat to Muslim rule in the region. "My Lord Gerard," addressed the Sultan with calm dignity, "I do not ask for mercy, for I know that our orders are sworn enemies of your faith. But I would ask that you remember that we fought with honor, and that our deaths serve some greater purpose than mere vengeance." Saladin studied the Grand Master for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. The Sultan had enormous respect for the military orders, even as he recognized the threat they posed. These men had dedicated their lives to war against Islam, but they had done so with a courage and commitment that commanded grudging admiration. Gerard de Ridefoot, the Sultan's voice was grave. "You speak truly. Your orders have been our enemies, but they have been worthy enemies. Your deaths will serve a purpose. They will ensure that the poison of holy war is drawn from the wound between our peoples." The executions that followed were carried out with clinical efficiency. The surviving Templars and Hospitallers met their fate with the same discipline they had shown in life, their prayers mingling with the evening air as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Their deaths marked the end of an era, the final chapter in the story of the military order's dominance in the Holy Land. But even as the blood of the condemned soaked into the earth, Saladin was already looking toward the future. The victory at Hattin had opened the door to Jerusalem itself, the holy city that had been the ultimate prize of the Crusades. Within weeks, the great fortress cities of Al-Rameh would fall one by one, their walls unable to withstand the psychological impact of the disaster that had befallen the Christian cause. As darkness finally fell over the battlefield, the Sultan stood alone outside his tent, contemplating the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, that curious experiment in European colonization, was finished. The true cross, that symbol of Christian power, was now in Muslim hands. The military orders that had terrorized the faithful for generations had been broken. Yet Saladin felt no great joy in his victory. War, even victorious war, brought only suffering and death. The true test of his achievement would come not in the heat of battle, but in the difficult work of governing, of building a lasting peace between the followers of Christ and the servants of Allah. The blood on the wind-blown sands of Hattin had purchased a victory, but victory alone was not enough. What mattered now was what would be built from the ashes of the old order. 3 days after the battle, The survivors of Hattin were a pitiful sight as they began their march into captivity. The proud knights who had ridden forth from Safria now stumbled through the dust on foot, their armor stripped away, their weapons confiscated, their dreams of glory transformed into the harsh reality of defeat. The sun that had been their enemy in battle continued to torment them in captivity, but now they lacked even the comfort of their faith. The true Croat was gone, carried away as a trophy of Muslim victory. King Guy de Lusignan rode in a simple cart, his royal dignity maintained by Saladin's express command, but his power utterly broken. The kingdom of Jerusalem was his in name only. In reality, it had ceased to exist the moment the last Christian knight threw down his sword on the slopes of Hattin. The chroniclers would record that Guy had lost his kingdom through poor judgment and worse counsel, but the truth was more complex. He had inherited an impossible situation and had been forced to make an impossible choice. The news of the disaster spread like wildfire throughout the Crusader states. In Antioch, Prince Bohemond III received word of the catastrophe with the stunned disbelief of a man who had just witnessed the impossible. The greatest army in the history of Aldrima had simply ceased to exist, taking with it the military backbone of Christian resistance in the East. What sort of prince could manage when his messenger finished delivering the grim tidings? How could 20,000 men simply vanish? The answer lay in the fundamental miscalculation that had driven the Christian army to destruction. The Crusaders had treated the Battle of Hattin as if it were just another engagement in their long struggle against Islam. But Saladin had recognized it as something far more significant, a decisive moment that would determine the fate of the Holy Land for generations to come. Contemporary Muslim sources, including the account of Ibn al, describe the victory at Hattin as a day when Allah delivered the Holy Land back to the faithful and broke the power of the infidels forever. Within days of the battle, Saladin's forces were on the march. The great fortress cities that had anchored Christian rule in the east, Ascalon, Gaza, Jaffa, fell in rapid succession, their walls unable to withstand the psychological impact of Hattin. The garrisons, demoralized by the news of the disaster and lacking the manpower to mount effective resistance, surrendered with minimal fighting. But the greatest prize still awaited. Jerusalem, the holy city, the ultimate objective of every crusade, lay virtually defenseless. The Queen Sabila, Guy's wife, had fled to the coastal city of Tyre with the few remaining nobles, leaving the ancient city to face its fate alone. The walls that had withstood Saladin's previous attacks now seemed pitifully inadequate against the full force of the Sultan's victorious army. The siege of Jerusalem began on September 20th, exactly 100 years after the First Crusade had begun its march to the east. The symbolism was not lost on either side. This was the completion of a historical cycle, the final act in the drama that had begun with Pope Urban II's call to arms at Clermont. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few senior commanders to survive Hattin, had made his way to Jerusalem to organize the city's defense. But what defense could he mount with a handful of surviving knights and a population of terrified civilians? The military orders were broken, the royal army was destroyed, and the neighboring kingdoms were too concerned with their own survival to offer assistance. "We cannot hold the city," Balian reported to the Patriarch Heraclius, his voice heavy with the weight of inevitable defeat. "We have perhaps 300 knights, a few thousand sergeants, and the will of God. Against Saladin's entire army, it is not enough." The Patriarch, a man more suited to the intrigues of the royal court than the harsh realities of warfare, wrung his hands in despair. "Then we are lost. The holy city will fall to the infidels once more." Balian's response was characteristic of the man, practical, honest, and tinged with the grim humor of a soldier who had seen too much. "My lord, the city fell the moment the true cross hit the ground at Hattin. We are merely acknowledging what has already occurred." The siege lasted only 12 days. On October 2nd, 1187, the defenders of Jerusalem opened the gates and surrendered the city to Saladin. The Sultan's entry into the holy city was a masterpiece of political theater. He came not as a conqueror but as a liberator, showing mercy to the Christian population and restraint in his treatment of the holy sites. The contrast with the Crusader conquest of 1199 could not have been more stark. Where the Christian knights had waded through rivers of blood, Saladin offered terms of surrender. Where the